I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And let's just take a moment to set up our motivation. That we're here studying Lamrim, the stages of the path together. Particularly with the motivation of compassion, and loving kindness and compassion for others. Recognizing that just as we ourselves are subject to so many kinds of suffering, so are all other sentient beings. Interdependence with others. My well-being and happiness depends upon others, and others' well-being and happiness depends upon me. All my happiness of past lives came from the kindness of others. All the good things that happen in this life, definitely we can see obviously are dependent upon others. And then in future lives, also same thing. Even if I'm hoping to progress to enlightenment, still that depends upon others. So now my purpose is out of a sense of connectedness with others, loving kindness and compassion for others. We'll study the stages of the path to enlightenment. In order to progress towards enlightenment, and become, as that verse said, right, by practicing perfections, to become a Buddha, to be of benefit to others, to be of the ultimate benefit. So then we're studying with a sense of love, of compassion, of altruism, and finally of bodhicitta. So with that in mind, then we can turn to the text. Excuse me. And so we've been talking about. I should be able to say, like, so. This text, right, is by Lama Tsongkhapa, who was a great enlightened teacher, a great saint. From the 1400s in Tibet. And one thing that's definitely true of Lama Tsongkhapa is that he both studied very, very extensively all the Buddha's teachings, and then did intensive meditation practice. And this text really is like, he wrote many texts, but this text in particular kind of he says in the beginning, right, it summarizes the very essence of the Buddha's teachings in a clear way for anybody to practice. And so, because there are such vast topics in Buddhism, and so one thing Lama Tsongkhapa is doing in this text is presenting those teachings in a way that makes it practical and easy to implement, so to speak. So that's, so we're studying this in order to be able to then practice like that. And most recently, right, we've been covering this topic of the preciousness, the precious human rebirth, or the we call it the precious human rebirth. Right? And so we went through certain topics, right? The 8 freedoms and 10, so 18 special qualities of the kind of human rebirth where you can really make spiritual progress. So the first step, right, was we were checking, do I have that kind of rebirth? That kind of, is this birth that we have now that kind of rebirth, right? Do I have these 18 qualities, which Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, right, are extremely difficult and rare to find. Well, you can see that. So the first step was we kind of checked, do I have that kind of rebirth? But the idea being that this particular kind of rebirth as a human being, at a time when a Buddha has come and has taught and so on, all these different qualities, is the best life form for making spiritual progress. That was the idea there. So first you're checking, and so which gives a kind of, and remember, this is partly to overcome laziness, it's partly to get a sense of inspiration, partly to get a sense of enthusiasm. But anyway, so that first section is where you kind of realize, okay, I do have that kind of very unique kind of rebirth, which according to, which then we get to the second section, which is having recognized you have that kind of rebirth, what are the special benefits of that? And what Lama Tsongkhapa presents is the meaning of that kind of rebirth, right? Which means, in particular, what he points out is that from a point of view of both spiritual progress, from a point of view of creating karma, special kinds of karma and so on, that this kind of rebirth that you have, what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is, it's the most powerful, the most spiritually powerful, the most useful of all things in the universe, really is what he's saying, right? That there's no better rebirth than yours for making spiritual progress. And so that counteracts the idea, sometimes people feel, right, it's actually one of the kinds of, in Buddhism, there's one kind of laziness, which is sort of thinking, oh, it's too hard, or like, oh, I'm not good enough, or oh, I don't have something, I'm not capable. It's funny that that's considered a form of laziness in Buddhism. I always think it's funny, actually, I'm going off on a slight tangent. Being really busy can also be a form of laziness in Buddhism. If you're very busy, like if you're busy with the wrong things, they consider that a form of laziness too. Spiritual laziness in that sense, right? And so the idea here is that it's overcoming these kinds of laziness to say, wow, what I have, this very unique rebirth, with it, I can achieve anything. And what the Buddha is saying is, especially on this planet at this time, it says, if you want to achieve good future rebirths, you can achieve that. If you want to achieve liberation from samsara, in other words, like moksha or nirvana, in this life you can achieve that. And he says, if you want to realize bodhicitta, in this life you can become a bodhisattva. Even because of the highest yoga tantra teachings, if you want to become a fully enlightened Buddha in this life and you're willing to make enough effort, then you can achieve that. And so he says everything is possible with your rebirth. And so the idea is not to think, I just want to remind you, at that point, the idea is not to think, oh, that's nice, some people can do that, right? The idea is to think, oh, I myself could do that if I want to, right? In other words, if in your meditation it feels like something intellectualized or something that applies to like the person next to you but not yourself, then you're not doing it right. The idea is that it should apply to you, that you should start to feel, oh wow, I could actually achieve all of that. So that's under the heading, the great value of this rebirth of leisure and opportunities that you have. And so you can get the feeling there, at a certain point you start to feel, right, if you've contemplated, I have this kind of rebirth, it's the most valuable thing, it's like incomparable, how valuable it is. You start to feel a sense of enthusiasm. And then we're on then there's a third general headline, which we could call, it's the rarity and the difficulty of finding it and how to take its essence. There are different ways of presenting it, which we'll go over, but we've kind of started on this section. And what we got up to now is the method of meditation with 4 special features. So I want to cover this now. So this is the next topic in Lama Tsongkhapa's outline. So we've talked a little. Actually, the last time we meditated a little bit about how rare this kind of rebirth is, also. That it's extremely rare. So, and we'll get more into that. But next, what Lama Tsongkhapa presents is 4 topics of meditation that you would actually meditate upon next. Um, so the first of these, and for those who have the text, we're on page 42, near the bottom. But the first of these, I'll read the title, the name of it, I'll read what he says. The need to accomplish the Dharma because all sentient beings only want happiness and do not want suffering. And attaining happiness and eliminating suffering only depends on the holy Dharma. So, so this first point, right, recognizing that I have this extremely rare, extremely precious opportunity, you might. So then the first topic, right, is you think you could begin with yourself actually saying like, I want happiness and I don't want to suffer, and I have the ability to achieve that. Then also my loved ones want happiness and don't want to suffer, right? And then you can expand it outward. All beings, right? Like so, strangers, enemies, you know, it's like people I've never met. We're all the same in wanting happiness and not wanting to suffer. Right? And so with this one, you know, the idea here, right, is you're trying to remember why practice Dharma. And so part of the idea as you get into this point is, I have this opportunity and others don't have that. Right? And their well-being depends upon me practicing. Does that make sense? And so, like to not do it now, right? And actually this is true, I just want to say, like, just like step back for a moment. This is a very true point, right? And this point is actually, I mean, you could spend months just talking about this one point, really. Because it's very true, right? Everybody wants happiness and doesn't want to suffer, right? And the idea is, sometimes like, the idea is that if I don't practice Dharma, then I myself and others will suffer. And that's true, actually, right? And it's very true, like, so, for example, if we've heard Dharma teachings, to start with ourselves, right? If I've heard Dharma teachings, but then I don't practice them, I don't put them into practice, then what happens, right? Actually, check your own experience, right? There is like, even if you like have some intellectual understanding of something, right? If you let yourself get overwhelmed by desire, or overwhelmed by anger, right? Or overwhelmed by pride, or jealousy, right? Then your mind is completely miserable, right? And then the fact that you've met the Dharma, right, isn't making you happy because you're not practicing it. And if I continue to do that, that will continue through this life and into my future lives, and then I'll never have another perfect human rebirth again for eons, right, is the idea. Then also others, right? And you might say, well, how does my, like, because it says all sentient beings only want happiness, and no one said, right? So you might say, well, how does my practicing Dharma help others, right? Well, to begin with, like, if you practice Dharma, I'll start with this, Lama's overview points out. To begin with, if you just start practicing Dharma, you'll stop hurting people so much. He says, and that alone is a wonderful beginning point. Because actually, like, all the time you're going around making problems for people. Because of our, you know, like, in other words, that's what, as long as we're self-centered, that's just what we do, actually, right? Like, that we make all kinds of problems for others. And then he points out, so just practicing Dharma, you're giving others so much peace, which is that you stop, for example, killing them. Then you stop stealing from them. Then you stop lying to them. Then you stop actually just getting on their nerves, right? Like, and the more you practice Dharma, the less you harm others. Right? Then also, sometimes Lama Zoparshi points out, he says, we all also have a very limited mind where we only think of this life. And then he says, but if you actually continue to practice self-centeredness, right? A self-centered being in future lives, you're not going to have a precious human rebirth again, most likely, right, if you stay so. But we sometimes think I'm somehow inherently different from people who do mass shootings, right, that's in the news lately, or dictators, or other people who do, you know, what do you call it, like war criminals or things like that. And one thing that, actually in Buddhism there's two categories of, you know, like there's, one way they categorize beings as noble beings who have seen reality directly, and then ordinary beings. So as long as we're still an ordinary being, which we are, they point out is like over future lives, if we don't realize bodhicitta and then realize emptiness, you know, if we find ourselves in the external circumstances of some of those people, we'll become like them. Whereas we're not inherently different from them. We're self-centered, they're self-centered, right? Whereas if your parent were a dictator and you were raised that way and then you might become like that. So we should, actually it's a mistake to, and when we think, oh, I'm like this, but those people are so bad, right? That's a mistake, actually. I'm the same as them, actually. I just happen to have better circumstances right now, temporarily. If I don't practice Dharma, in the future I'll be just like that. Then also, right, like, in terms of others' happiness, right? If you realize bodhicitta, right, and become a bodhisattva and progress along the path, you can think, how many beings are there who are depending on you? Right? Or who would be benefited by you, personally? And you could say, well, there's other bodhisattvas, right? As long as the Dalai Lama or something, I don't know. But actually a lot of people don't have any connection to the Dalai Lama, right? Like, there are a lot of people who don't have any connection to the Dalai Lama, but they would have a connection to you if you become enlightened. So their happiness depends on you, actually. That's what this is saying. And those people don't have the opportunity. There is they don't have a precious human rebirth, you do. So what this is saying, I mean, this is a very deep point, right? Is it saying your own happiness and others' happiness, temporary happiness, happiness of future lives, all the way up to happiness of enlightenment, depends on you practicing Dharma now. That's what this is really saying. And that it's like a responsibility, big responsibility, in a sense. And I'll just give one more analogy. It's like say this, if everyone, I'm just going to give an analogy for a moment. If everyone you knew, right, had been exposed to a horrible disease, and you went somewhere and there was the cure for that disease, right? There was medicine. And all you had to do was ask for it and take it and carry it back. And then you thought, oh, I'm not going to bother. I'm too busy. That's the analogy of this. That's what that's sort of an analogy for what this is saying. It's like, you're the person in the pharmacy. Nobody else is going to get there. If you don't bring back if you don't take the medicine yourself, right, so you can get back, and then you get back and give it to others, it's almost, what's the word, shameful, stupid? Earlier there was a verse that said, there's nothing really more stupid than that. That's what this is saying, right? And this is Lama Tsongkhapa trying to say, I just want to point out one more thing about this. When you think of yourself, this probably isn't how you view yourself, right? Whereas you don't necessarily often think, oh, that's the nature of my existence. And what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is, that's because you didn't study Dharma. As you were raised where maybe, whatever, the idea was, well, try to make a good living and buy a mini mansion or something, was the idea of success, right? I don't know whatever it was for you. Lama Tsongkhapa is saying he studied Buddhist teachings extensively, right? The teachings of the Buddha and the teachings of the Bodhisattvas, the teaching of the great Indian masters. And he's saying, this is your situation, and you don't recognize it. So there's a few say, well, that's not how I usually see myself. He's saying, that's why you're studying Lam Rim. This is your existential situation, is what he's saying, right? Is that you're the person who has this unbelievable opportunity. Other people, nobody else has that. They're suffering horribly. You're going to suffer horribly unless you take the medication, right? And that medication is the teachings, right? So if you apply them to yourself and you cure yourself, then you'll be able to cure others of their suffering. And if you miss this opportunity, then the amount of suffering will be humongous for yourself and for others. That's what he's saying there, right? So you see, if you start to contemplate, so I'm just giving an example of how you contemplate it, right? So you would contemplate that again and again until you feel, oh my goodness, it really would be stupid. How foolish would I be to waste time? Then he gets to the next one, the ability to accomplish the Dharma. So this is the second of the 4 points. That you have the ability to accomplish the Dharma because you have the external condition as spiritual teacher and the internal condition, leisures and endowments. Right? And so that's saying, if you have some doubt, well, maybe, this really does come up, I just want to point that out, if you try practicing sincerely, there are moments, right? Everybody I've ever talked to has that, where they feel, well, I don't, I'm not so great, or I'm not capable. Not like pride, but just like feeling insecure, feeling like it's hard to accomplish. Like to, if you say you can become a bodhisattva, you can become a saint, you can become a Buddha, right? Um, it's true, right? There'll be moments where you think, I don't know, or something like, I'm not so sure about that. Look at my mind. And then you might look at the lives of the great sages of the past. And you say, well, I'm not at all like them. But earlier we got the example of Milarepa, right? Who early in his life was a murderer, actually. And within one life he became a Buddha. He's one of the most famous saints of Tibet. Right? Where in his early life, he actually killed a whole group of people. Right? And by the end of his life, he was a fully enlightened Buddha. And so you can kind of stop and say, well, actually I didn't murder anybody. So, or if you did, you probably didn't murder as many people as Milarepa did. But so this idea is that he did that, right? And the idea here is, if you checked, right, do I have those 18 qualities, right, which we went through? And the other one is having met a spiritual teacher, right? So there's that, and we all have, it's actually, I'll say that too. I've said this a little bit before, but for us, it's actually so easy to meet spiritual teachers. Like, sometimes the Dalai Lama comes to America every year, pretty much, right? Like sometimes twice a year. Just went back, couldn't do this tour, but and Ken Rinpoche comes here, like it's not hard to meet great spiritual teachers. There are quite a few who come to the U.S. Regularly, right? And so the idea is, right, that in those ways, it's just important to get this point. This is to overcome like lack of confidence or low self-esteem, whatever you want to call it. It's basically saying, if you say to yourself, "Oh, but I can't," that's wrong. It's just an excuse. It's not true. Actually. If you have those 18 qualities, first of all, if you have those, it's not hard to meet spiritual teachers. The only difference is make effort. You either make effort at spiritual practice or you don't. But you are capable. That's what this point is saying. Does that make sense? You have all the circumstances, internal circumstances, right, which are having those qualities, and the external circumstances of spiritual teachers around, then you can definitely do it. So these are overcoming different kinds of laziness, actually, in a way. Right? Then the third point is to overcome another kind of laziness. I'll just read it first. The need also to accomplish Dharma in this life, because if you do not accomplish it within this life, it will be difficult to find leisures and endowments in many, many future lives. So this is the one to overcome another kind of laziness, the laziness of procrastination. Right? And people do that, actually. Like they say, well, it's really hard to practice. Like it's hard to tame my mind. So, and then they just say like, oh, maybe I'll be able to practice in a future life. And they maybe light a candle and say, oh, I offer the candles to the Buddha, can I practice in a future life? And again, Lama Tsongkhapa is being pretty direct here. And he's saying, like, what? He's basically saying if you think that way, first of all, you're being lazy, right? And second of all, worse than, that's not like an insult or something. It's saying it's not going to work. What he's saying is like, if you try to take that approach, right, to say, oh, well, it's hard in this life, so I'll do it in a future life, he's saying, now is when you have the best life form, right? This is the moment where you have the best life form in the universe for practicing Dharma. So if you think, oh, I'll wait until I find a better one, he's saying then you're completely insane. That's like, what's the way to say it? It's like saying, it'd be like somebody said, like if you had like, what's the word? If somebody won the lottery that day, and then they like had the winning ticket and they heard the numbers and they said, wow, this is the winning lottery ticket. I won like $25 million. And they said, well, but I've heard there are like $400 million lotteries. I'm going to rip it up and throw it out. And what he's saying is, good luck winning it again. Like that's not going to happen. Like in other words, this is the one where you won. Like in other words, you just won the lottery. You're the lottery winner now. If you rip up this ticket hoping you're going to get another one, what does he say? It's not going to happen for many future lifetimes. You're not going to get it again. And so this is the one to cash in your ticket by practicing. Again, I'm using metaphors here, but you get the point that he's getting at. So he's saying, don't think I'll do it in a future life. If you think that, you haven't understood this topic. Does that make sense? Now is the time to practice. So then there's one more obvious form. The next, so if you think that, right, you go, okay, I get it. I won't wait till future life, right? then lazy people will do the next thing, right? They'll say, he's right, when I retire, or then if you retire, you say, after I finish this, and then, like whatever the thing is going on, right? First you might say, or after I finish this project, and what he's saying is, I'll just read it, the need to accomplish the Dharma right now because the time of death is uncertain. Right? So what he's saying here is, he kind of knows us, right? So he knows if he can get through the thing of, well, I'll do it in a future life, then we might say, yeah, someday I'm going to do a retreat, or something like that, right? And what he's saying is, someday may not come. You have today, right? And this is just true. I mean, this is obvious, right? Like you can't debate this point, right? You can't say, oh no, I know I'm going to live till 90, like, unless you're a complete idiot, you know that, right? Or is that people die at any time, we don't know, and we don't know when, right? And so he's saying, apply that understanding to your relationship to the Dharma, right? So in other words, when you think, oh, today I'm busy, I'll practice tomorrow, right? What Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is, remember, you have this very precious opportunity, but it may not last till tomorrow. It certainly may not last 10 years. It may not last 5 years. Right? And so, if you know you have this opportunity and you really believe what he's saying, right, which is that you can achieve anything, right? But then you say, oh, but I'll wait a while to achieve it. And he's pointing out, and for what? Right? I'll just point out something, right? I mean, there's an implication of this one, right? Which is, like, so if you say, I'm going to delay my Dharma practice for money, right? What he's pointing out, there's an implication of this, right? Well, you may die before you spend that money, right? If you're saying, I'll delay it because I want to, make my house look pretty, or find a good partner, or whatever it would be, right? Whatever that thing that you would delay it for will be, what he's saying is like that, there's one way, sometimes they use the term, that has no essence to it. Right? There is, now is the time to practice Dharma. And, if you're going to do other things, do it while integrating Dharma into that. That's, if you're going to do things, other external activities, integrate Dharma into them, but don't wait, and make your main internal focus Dharma practice. Does that make sense? Make that the main focus of your mind every day, because you don't know how many days you have. And so he points out, right, the third counteract, he says it here, the third point that he had counteracts the laziness of thinking I'll practice it in later lives. The fourth one overcomes the laziness of thinking I'll do it later. So it's, these are like the laziness of procrastination, right? Reasons to put things off. And so, anyway, I mean, he just says there are different ways of combining those points, but you get the idea here, right? So these points are just saying, having contemplated this this thing of great value, and the idea, again, I'll just point out one more thing before we go on to the next topic. Actually, maybe I'll say it here. So the idea here, right, is, again, like this idea of precious human rebirth, right? This whole topic of precious human rebirth. In one way, it's sort of, it is the Buddhist worldview, right, of the different realms of existence and the nature of sort of what allows a person to progress towards enlightenment or Buddhahood. But the idea here, you can see that what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at, is that we're trying to integrate that worldview into our being so that it affects us, right? And I sometimes say that if you do, especially with these last 4 points, at the end of the fourth point, like, it shouldn't be just intellectual, right? It shouldn't just be some kind of distant thing. And the analogy I sometimes give is the Charles Dickens story. Scrooge on Christmas morning, right? When he wakes up after having sort of seen his selfishness up to that point, and then seen sort of his own death and essentially going to hell, right? And he wakes up, right? And he doesn't think, wow, someday I should really do something positive, right? It's like he's so happy that he's alive in that moment, right? That he's like, oh, I still have this human life. Let me do something with it, right? And there's like a great enthusiasm, right, for that. The idea is that we should, if we integrate this understanding into ourselves, we'll feel some of that every morning then, right? Like, oh, I'm awake, I can practice again. Wow, I can progress towards enlightenment. Oh, it's amazing. You know, and with great enthusiasm, this kind of feeling of passion, right? And I think let's sort of say this, like, maybe I'll say that, like, if you really get the precious human rebirth, if you understand this topic and you really integrate it into your being, you know how, like, let's say it, everybody's excited for something, right? Like, if you look around, right, like, everybody really likes some activity, right? Like, so some people will go to great hardships to party, right? Like, and they'll stay up all night partying, right? Because they think that's what's happy, right? Other people will go through great hardships, like to hunt and fish, right? Like, get up really early in the morning and freeze themselves and hide under a bush and, like, you know, all kinds of things, right? Sit in on a plank in the middle, like a freezing cold. They're sitting on like a piece of wood for 12 hours. Like, other people, it's vacations. For somebody else, it might be sexuality or something, right? But, like, whatever a person thinks is valuable, they'll go to great hardships to do, right? And they'll do it for hours and hours with great, you know, they'll lose sleep, like, right? They'll get up early, you'll, like, skip sleep, you'll spend money, you'll, like, give up all kinds of things, right? You'll, like, leave away from your family to go do something, right? And so the question I have, like, just to contemplate with this point is, if you get this, then you'll be that way about Dharma, right? Like, you'll be that excited. It's not like, so if your attitude towards the Dharma is like, well, I'm supposed to do that, or like, somebody told me, whatever, my Lama said I'm supposed to do that, I guess I'll try to do it, and you're kind of like, oh, or something, then you haven't understood precious human rebirth, right? Whereas precious human rebirth is like, where if you understand what he's saying here, right, the happiness of yourself and others and so on, right? Like, and Shantideva uses analogies like that, right? He uses the analogies of, like, in some of his texts where he talks about fighting the inner delusions, right? He gives the analogy in Shantideva in the Guides of the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. He gives an analogy where he says, like, he talks about sort of like fighters or soldiers or warriors or something, right? And he says, like, you know, they'll go through incredible hardships, and then when they get, like, what's the word, like, cuts or like wounds, that's what, wounds, they, like, show, oh, look, I was wounded, and, like, they're proud of that, right? And then he says, and all they were doing was slaying corpses. In other words, they were fighting and somebody was going to die anyway. It wasn't anything, you know, it was like totally, there was no meaning to that at all. Then he says, if you're trying to practice Dharma, you should, the idea, the goal in a way, or if you get this point, you should be more enthusiastic than that, to bear hardships and, like, excited to, not like, you know, so sometimes we feel like, you know, you know, well, yeah, spiritual practice is important, but it's like, it should be convenient for me. It shouldn't be that difficult. I don't want to do really hard practices. I'd like it to be like, I don't want to get up early or stay up. I remember that once, like, His Holiness Sakya Treason was giving, like, some teaching. It was like a secret golden Dharma teaching. And he said, and if you have spiritual obstacles, he said, like, get up before dawn and start to do this practice. And people in the audience, like, were like, I'm not getting up before dawn. And it was like, I was like, oh my God, how embarrassing to be part of that audience. Or so I was like, you know, or like, I mean, all the spiritual, the point is like, if you understand this point, there's, like, that kind of enthusiasm, right? The enthusiasm, like a warrior who's proud of his injuries, or like the, yeah, I remember, well, I'll just share that story. One time I remember one of my teachers, Rebbe Rinpoche, was sick, and we had to go to an early appointment, so I got up early, and I was like, drove to his house, and I was driving him to the hospital, or doctor's office, and he said, you look really tired. And I am really tired. And then he said, how great that you're tired for helping somebody. He said, like, a lot of people are tired early in the morning, just like at the same hour right now, because they're going to kill something. And he, like, you know, they're going to kill something, right? And he said, you're tired because you're helping somebody. How wonderful, you know. Like, and it's interesting, right? Like, whereas the idea is, like, to have that kind of, what's the word? the idea, I guess I'm just getting at it, right? Like, people who are going out to, people who like decide to take their vacation and go hunting, right? Like, they're not complaining that they're up early. They're not complaining that they're sleeping on a hard floor. They're not complaining that, right? So I guess I'm just giving it out that if we are complaining that we have to practice Dharma, then we're misunderstanding something, right? There is like, and it comes from this idea of precious human rebirth, that if you really get this well, do you see how you'll have like incredible enthusiasm? That's the point. Incredible energy. Like where you'll be happy, oh, can I stay up all night to practice? Can I get up early to pray? Like, how can I, it's not like, oh, how do I fit it in? It's like, you know what I mean? Like sometimes if you talk to people about their spiritual practice, it's like, how can I fit it in between I have to work and I have whatever, this commitment and that commitment and all these other things that seem more important to me, right? That's the implication. And the point is, if you get precious human rebirth, if you really get that point, then it's like, what's there to say it? There's that kind of enthusiasm and excitement and energy that doesn't decrease over time. Urgency too, yeah. Yeah, urgency is a good metaphor too, right? Because like, isn't it? That's true, right? Like, whereas, you know, when there's like, what's there to say it? Like, it is like that, right? In other words, if you think of like, if somebody's, you know, if you see somebody about to die, right, like drown or something, you don't say, oh, I'll save them in a future life. Right? You don't say, oh, I'll save them after I retire, or something. Or I'll save them after I have a vacation, feel, you know, right? And what he's saying in these points is it's like that. It's like you're seeing people drowning. Right? And if you say, I'll practice later, it's the equivalent of that. Right? It's saying they're drowning, but that's not that important to me.
Dr. Lauren, I have a question. So we're basically talking about having a joyous effort in Dharma. Be joyous enough and be energetic. Well, how do you set the motivation? How do you get that deep motivation? Is that a part of conditioning, or is that part of something that you can learn in this lifetime? Or do you actually carry it over?
See, the idea really is that you have to condition it in this lifetime, first of all. Like what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is, this is the only lifetime to condition it. So you have to do it in this lifetime. And the way to do it, actually in this section, the way to do it is by thinking about, actually the Lam Rim is the way to do it, really. In other words, and, I was going to say this, like, again, like if you're, let's say this, like, you know, so if it's easy for you to get let's say it's easy, if you check with yourself, if you introspect honestly in your own heart, right, and you say, okay, for me it's very easy to get motivated about this, whether it's my family, or money, or status, or promotion, or a fancy house, or a nicer car, whatever it would be, I don't know, you make your own, you know, whatever you're naturally motivated to do, right? What the Lam Rim is implying is, of course you're motivated for those kind of things. You didn't practice Dharma in a past life, right? Your conditioning is to grasp at, what you naturally are grasping at is just whatever your habit was. And everybody grasps at something, right? So, and again, that's what I was saying earlier, it's all different things for different people, but everybody's grasping at something. And last week we said, like last time in class, we said, what should we say, you know, spiders also grasp at things, and rats do too, and so do fish, and so do all different, you know, like, spiders grasp really strongly, right, at flies, you know, like, and what this is getting at is like, so we're like them, that's all, like, you know, up till now, I'm like a spider, right, I'm grasping at something, and what this is saying is, if you don't have the tendency to be strongly motivated to Dharma, well, that's normal. Like, of course, you know, you didn't practice in past lives, but there's no better life than this one to practice. So how do you get the motivation? Whereas if you just wait for inspiration to come from random, like if you kind of wait around saying, "Oh, someday I'll get inspired to practice Dharma," what Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying is, no, everything arises from causes and conditions. Whereas if you don't have the causes and conditions to have inspiration, then create them now. And how do you create them? By thinking about precious human rebirth, for example, right? By going through and meditating every day, you know. And that would be the idea, is that if you meditate like ideally, right? This is if you think of like in the true way of doing it, right? At least once a day, maybe 4 times a day, if you meditate on precious human rebirth and on permanence and death, which is the next topic. Actually, I'll say that. I mean, I'm going a little ahead here, but I'll just mention one thing that Rinpa Rinpoche used to say, because he was a real master of the Lam Rim. He had studied with Wonka Rinpoche, was great, had realized it, and so on. One thing he used to say is, he said, really, precious human rebirth and impermanence and death are like the main fuel and the main engine that carry your Dharma practice forward, and that get you to have the inspiration. He said, and that's actually true all the way up until you realize bodhicitta. He said, once you realize bodhicitta, it's almost like, what's it say it? You know, like when rockets are going up, like at a certain point they drop one and they keep going. It's like when you realize bodhicitta, then that becomes your main fuel. And he used to say that when you realize bodhicitta, then that becomes your natural fuel that inspires your Dharma practice. He said, until you realize bodhicitta, it's mainly understanding precious human rebirth and understanding impermanence and death that really motivate you and that inspire you and that give you a passion for Dharma. And he said, so if you meditate deeply on precious human rebirth, on impermanence and death, then you will have the inspiration. And then you keep that inspiration going, and eventually you'll realize bodhicitta, and then that'll take you on all the way to enlightenment, this metaphor, right? So that's the way to get those, is through contemplating these points again and again until they affect your being. And that's when it starts to create passion for Dharma practice, or urgency, as Jody put it. Is that the word used? Urgency. So, actually, maybe I'll go on now because it relates directly to this point. So then what Lama Tsongkhapa says is, so how do you do that, right? How should you contemplate? And that's on the next page. So he says, one thing he says, when we do the meditation class on this, which we'll do, where we do 3 hours of actual meditation, we'll do it in the long way. But what Lama Tsongkhapa says then is, and this is, I think, quite an important point. I'll read this one line. As the mind will be more significantly subdued if you contemplate leisures and endowments from various points of view, you should contemplate them as explained above. If you can't do that, then do it this other way. Right? So what he's saying is, you have to know your own mind, first of all. Right? You have to check from your own experience what inspires you, what moves you. Right? And so he's saying that's why, what Lama Tsongkhapa is here saying is, I presented a whole bunch of different meditation topics and ways of thinking about this. Right? And he's saying, try them out, see what inspires you, right? And he says, ideally, you would take all those points and sort of look at it from many angles in order to inspire yourself. And I want to make a comment on this. Like, you may say, well, it's like tiring to do it from many angles, or I don't know, it seems too complicated to do it. But what I want to point out is what he's saying here is psychological. And I want to give an analogy from it. Like, so we say this, like, okay, when you have a delusion, a deluded state of mind, you reinforce it from many different angles. It's actually true, right? So like if you're, for example, if you really want something, right? Like you think of all different reasons why it's great, right? Oh, it'd be so good in this way, it'd be so good in that way, and it'd be awesome, and oh, wow, this would be cool. And like you think of how other people would think of it, you think of what happiness it would give you think about like all different angles on why it's good. Same way, if you're really angry at somebody, you think of all different angles on why they're bad. Right? Like, they did this wrong, they did that wrong, they don't even look good, they treat other people like that, nobody likes them, they're terrible, right? Like you go from all different angles. What he's saying is that's how the mind works, right? Is that when we really are passionate about something, we look at it from many angles, and that's how we sort of develop that energy. So he's saying here, look at it from various points of view, right? Use all the above, right? And then he says, and then check which ones are most inspiring to you and do those even more, right? And you'll get more and more inspiration. So you get the idea this is not like a dry or sort of intellectualized thing. It's really a way of like, let's say it. You contemplate and you see what moves you, right? And you do that more and more, and then you get almost like, again, I'm using a lot of analogies today, I hope you don't mind. But it's like getting a flame going, right? like you're checking which thing is burning, and then you add more and more of it, right? And then you can add the other parts, right? Once it's really burning, you can add the other parts, and it goes more and more, right? So it'd be like that. Like, what starts to inspire me to feel a precious human rebirth? Like, if you find a certain point, stay with it for a while, right? Until it's really hot, you know. And then if you add the other contemplations on, it's going to become more and more, what's the word, steady, and it's not going to flicker. It's going to sort of blaze, in a sense, right? I'm using that metaphor. So the idea is do that, right? Check your own mind and keep contemplating and keep sort of, right? And you, from earlier, Lama Tsongkhapa was saying, right? You'd be doing the preliminary practices, and you'd be contemplating this, and you'd be like outside of the session still thinking about it, and maybe reading some texts on it. And the idea would be it would become, until it becomes spontaneous, right? Until it becomes your way of feeling about yourself in the world. That's the idea here. And what he says is, if you somehow can't do all the points he gave, then he says, then just meditate on under 3 headings. Right? If you can't do all the above, so better to do all the above, right? And he says, if you can't do that, then do it under 3 headings. So the first heading is, and we just went through these actually. What is a life of leisure? You know, what are the 18 qualities? Do I have them? Right? That's the first. The second point is the manner in which they are greatly meaningful from a temporary and ultimate point of view. Right? Temporary meaning they can help me have good future rebirths. Ultimate meaning they can lead me to enlightenment or to Buddhahood. Right? So that's the second of the 3 main points. And the third is how difficult they are to find from the point of view of cause and effect. One thing I'll point out, I mentioned this last time. If you look, for example, in some of the other Lamrim, like Lama Tsongkhapa does a very extensive treatment of precious human rebirths, right? If you look at some of the other texts, like Pabonka Rinpoche's Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, or some of the other briefer texts, they cover them under these 3, although Pabonka Rinpoche changes the third. So it's not just from the point of view of cause and effect. He adds into that one also from the point of view of the nature, like if you look around, there aren't that many, and also the point of view of an analogy, right? Like either the analogy of the dust on your fingernail compared to all the dust on the planet, or the analogy of the turtle going through the, some of you know that. So, but anyway, so those other texts kind of use these 3. They don't do the extensive. When we meditate, we'll do the extensive version, according to Lama Tsongkhapa's personal approach that he recommends in this book. And he says here, so you should take up each of these points above as they suit you and meditate. Right? So again, he's saying check your own mind, but still stay with the general outline, right? In other words, you have to go through it. So it's not enough just to say, yeah, I have a precious human rebirth, but not to understand its value. Otherwise, then so what? Like, then you feel so what? Right? Or if you don't understand its rarity, then again, you may feel so what? I'll always have a prayer. I mean, really, many Buddhists practice as if like that were the case, right? They practice Buddhism as if they think that they'll always have this or a better opportunity. The Buddha said no. I don't know why they do that then. The Buddha didn't say that. Like, I don't know why Buddhists do that. I think it must be some idea that Lama Tsongkhapa's pointing out, that they think, oh, I'll just do it in a future life. But Lama Tsongkhapa and the Buddha are both saying the same thing, which is, this chance doesn't come again, so take the opportunity now. And then, yeah, I'll just cover this next point, and then I'll pause for questions. So then, what Lama Tsongkhapa next says is, he says also, remember how difficult it is. Next point is, he says, remember how difficult it is to achieve this kind of rebirth, because that was related to what I was just saying. And that sometimes, again, we may think, oh, I'll practice in a future life. And what he's saying is this. Here, there are many different ways to contemplate the rarity and difficulty of finding a precious human rebirth. Here, he does it from the point of view of cause and effect. And so in terms of cause, right, what he's saying is, what are the causes of your life? Right? So this is interesting, because this is implying what did you do in a past life to be who you are now. But it's also implying what does somebody have to do, what do you have to do to achieve this kind of rebirth again, or what would somebody else have to do to achieve this kind of rebirth that you have now, right? And he says, first of all, you have to have been highly ethical, right? Practice pure ethics, like so pure morality, right? Right? Restraining yourself from harming, from doing harmful actions and doing positive actions. Right? And then now pause there for a moment, and you ask yourself, how many beings do that? And this is not enough. That, by the way, I mean, that's just the first of the various causes he's going to get to, right? But so the first one, how many people practice very pure, stainless ethics? Jody's shaking her head. She's discouraged. But yeah, if you look in the world, right? I mean, if you, I mean, there is if you look at people you know and you look in the world, it's not that common. Actually, it's true, right? I mean, how many people like don't lie, right? Don't cheat, don't, sort of say it, like, don't use other people, don't, sort of say it, don't waste other people's time and so on, right? Gossiping and all that, like. And one other point here is like, and pure ethics also means like ideally it's with a commitment, right? So it's not just that they're like, so if, for example, one example with pure ethics is not killing just because you don't like. So for example, like killing animals or something. Not killing animals because you just don't do that. That's actually not. That's not really pure ethics. Actually, pure ethics means like having a clarity. I never want to harm others, and therefore I won't. That's pure ethics. So I mean, pure ethics is like with this idea of an understanding. I'm going to restrain myself from that because it's harmful. So like, or it's like if you don't lie because you're passed out drunk, that's not pure ethics, right? Like, that's actually terrible. But the point is that like pure ethics have to be with intention. Does that make sense? It's with a clear intention. I'm going to restrain myself from this because it's harmful. Again, at drug. I mean, that's another one, right? I'm going through the 10 non-virtues, right? Intoxicants and so. Oh, that's not one of the 10, but that's one of the 5 lay precepts. So, one is you have to practice pure ethics. That's rare. Then you have to combine that, right? Pure ethics, he says, with giving and the like. Right? So, second thing is you have to be purely ethical, then also generous, right? Generous to others. Right, because pure ethics is just the cause of a human life. But then, actually I was just reading a book that was very touching about like, you know, people living in like soul-crushing poverty. So then you don't have a precious human rebirth, right? You don't have the opportunities. So, so to have enough resources so that you can live and have some time to practice spirituality, you have to have been generous in past lives. Then also when it says, and the like here, so that implies the 6 perfections. Right? So that means also you have to be patient. Right? So when others insult you or harm you, are you patient? Do you respond with anger or do you respond with kindness to harm? Right? So now you pause and go, that's just the first, that's just 3 points, right? Then you start to say, okay, so how many people are doing that? Right? And he's saying, almost nobody, right? So from the point of view of cause, if you look around and you say, who's creating the causes for a precious human rebirth? He's giving these examples. Then he says, giving and like, right, so that means also patience, then joyful effort, so having some degree of joy and enthusiasm and excitement for spiritual practice. And then he says, and then conjoining that with stainless prayers. Right? So stainless prayers means that because all of those things you're creating good karma, right? If you're practicing ethics and generosity and patience and joyful effort and so on. Then he says, then you have to combine that with prayers, right? Stainless prayers. So it means you take all that and you don't think, you don't dedicate it just for this life, right? But you're dedicating those merits. May I be able to have a perfect human rebirth in a future life and practice Dharma and meet perfectly qualified spiritual teachers and practice flawlessly and so on. So the first question is like, who's doing all of that, right? Like who is there when they're harmed responds with love? Right? And then goes out and practices generosity while being ethical at the same time. Some people practice generosity while not being ethical, right? Some people are a little bit ethical but aren't very generous and so on. Who does all of those and then combines it with pure prayers? Stainless prayers, yeah. And what this is saying is you did that in a past life to be this person you are now. That's what this is saying, that in a past life you did all of that. And if you're not doing all of that now, you're not going to get this chance again, right? And so one thing is it's saying, wow, like I could see, if I look at other people, like if I look at myself, how hard it is to do those things, if I look at all the people around, right? No wonder it's rare to have repression from rebirth. Nobody's creating the causes of one, right? Almost nobody is doing that. And again, if you contemplate that, one is you should feel very, if you would, not should, but you will feel grateful to whoever you were in a past life for giving you this opportunity, right? And then you'll think, there's a saying like, don't wait, you'll look at yourself and you say, you know, that person in a past life was very kind to this life. Now if in this life I don't practice, then I'm really first of all, it's wasting all that effort. Secondly, it won't come again, and I'm being cruel to myself in future lives, actually. So it's saying don't make that mistake, right? But another is, it's saying it's so rare that, again, like, it's your responsibility to practice, right? You get the idea, and to take this essence of this, because it's such a rare occurrence, that came about through so much effort, actually, right? It was not easy to get to where you are now. From like, I'll just, do you mind, I'm going a little bit off. I'll just share one, I just think this is funny, actually. Professor Bob Thurman, he's a Buddhist professor, he sometimes says, which I think is quite funny, he says actually, he talks about he says spiritual evolution. He points out like it takes a huge amount of effort to evolve, because this kind of spiritual evolution comes through internal striving and effort, like is being described here by Lama Tsongkhapa. But the analogy he gives, he says, it took you so long to stop having an outer skeleton, like an insect, like an exoskeleton, like insects have. He says, and finally, like, you get a soft skin and like eyes and brain that can understand. He says, and then you get back inside an exoskeleton of a car and you drive around getting angry at everybody else. He said, how stupid is that? It was like you were like an insect, right, bumping into other insects with those like outside, it was a hard shell. And then finally you stop being an insect. He said, and then you get inside another shell and you start like, being angry at other people in their shell. And he says, that's a strange use of karma. But anyway, I thought that was funny. But what he said, so Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is, it's incredibly rare to have this because the causes are rare. Then he points out the difficulty of finding it in terms of the result, right? So one was that if you look around at who's creating those causes, almost nobody. The second point is in terms of the result. And what he points out, again, is just try to look at our own situation. Right? So what he's saying here is, we went through this earlier in another class, that on precious human rebirth, that according to Buddhism, right, there are more, this is clear, there are way more animals than there are humans, almost unimaginably more. Buddhism says there are that many more hungry ghosts than there are animals, and then there are that many more hell beings than there are hungry ghosts. So it's, according to the Buddhist worldview, the lower realms are humongously populated. And what this is saying is, which by the way, you can see from the point of view, if you look at the previous point about cause, you can see why that's true, can't you? Whereas like, right, it's so easy for like millions of people to make effort, like to hate. It's incredibly easy, isn't it? Like, whereas you can have like millions of people, and it's like, what's your say is? And actually, like, they spend millions and billions of dollars on hate, right? Like it's so, I mean, if you look at why are the lower realms more full, if you look at it in these 2 points, right? It's because it's so easy, right? Like, whereas like if you think about like hatred, like, and actually it's easy to hate millions of people, right? Like, whereas millions of people will hate other millions of people, and back and forth, right? And that's the cause of hell, right? Hatred. And then then they'll think, oh, I want to kill those millions of people. Like, I want to bomb them, or I want to send an army, right? And then they feel it very strongly, in a very overwhelming way, towards millions of, whereas even to create that strong of a love for one person is incredibly difficult, right? And when we do, like, if we're honest, even for us, ordinary people, if we do finally cultivate love even for one person, then we mix it with all kinds of attachment, right? Like, so finally we have a moment where you think, oh, I really love this person. And then we feel, but I want them to do what I want. And they should, like, be nice to me, and they should, like, make me dinner, and whatever. Take me out, do this, do that, like, whatever. do all kinds of things for me, then it's not love anymore. Then it's attachment, right? And so, like, it's incredibly difficult. And like, maybe if you get like, it's actually interesting, right? It's so hard. Like, when do millions of people sit around loving other millions of people for hours? But if you turn on the news, there are millions. I mean, I don't know how many people watch any given news show, but like, millions of people are sitting there hating, right, for hours. And I'm not talking about one political party only either. It seemed like that, but I'm not. Actually, everybody. In other words, everybody does that, right? Like, so, I mean, because sometimes if I say that, sometimes people will think, oh yeah, those other people do that. Whatever your party. I'm not saying, but I'm just saying, everybody does that. There is not everybody, but there are exceptions, but most people, that's what's happening, right? Whether it's people in another part of the world, or from another culture, or whether it's somebody in your own culture who you disagree with about some issue, right? Like, so if you look from the point of view of cause, right, it's so easy to create like huge amounts of hate, right? Well, that's the cause of hell from Buddhist point of view. I mean, hatred is in a way hell, right? Whereas, like, again, these other things, right, ethics and love, and to feel like, and also like, think about it, it's easy to feel hatred for like hours, right? Like you could, and how easy is it to feel love for hours without attachment? I'm not talking about like love that says, oh, I want this from this person. But like altruistic, because that's not love actually. That's grasping. Grasping is a different state of mind than love. But I'm talking about like loving kindness or altruism or something, right? Where you feel that strongly for hours in a row, right? So it's easy. So that's what the point of view is. If you look from the point of view of cause, it's really easy to create the causes for the lower realms, and it's really hard to create the causes for human rebirth, right? That's what this is saying, and that's true, right? I mean, again, like. That was just hatred, right? But like attachment, grasping, right? Like desirous grasping, like sort of craving and so on, right? It's easy to spend hours and hours and hours in that state of mind, isn't it? Right? Like, and oftentimes if you check, that's why the Buddhists call our realm the desire realm, right? Mostly because we go from one desire to another, right? So you might be thinking, like, so actually it's true, right? Like people, there's like sometimes you go, oh, I'm hungry, I want this food, and you're thinking, what kind of food? And you're grasping, I want that, and I want to get it. Then, like, while they're eating, they're saying, oh, what do we have for dessert? Right? What can we have? Then, like, after that, it's like, what can I do next? Right? But it's all, like, it's just a continuous, there's never a break, actually, from craving. That's actually true, right? Most of us, that's our state of mind, like, for hours and hours and hours and hours. And maybe I think that's sometimes why people are, like, say, like, we like long for deep sleep because that's the only time we have a break from craving. I don't know, it's insane. Yeah.
I have a question. So why is it easier from a psychological perspective to hate than to love, considering hate has a lot of negative feelings with it and love doesn't? So I don't understand why humans automatically find it easier to hate than to love.
The Buddhist answer to that, the Buddhist psychological answer, is that it's not, actually. There is that love actually is, say this. The Buddhist answer is that actually love is easier for two reasons. One is it makes you happy,
Right.
and the other is that it's realistic.
So
And so the Buddhist answer to why do people do that is that, let's say this, is kind of in line with what we're talking about. In other words, is that basically it's like that we haven't in this life or past lives practiced Dharma, and so we're completely like, really like, and I mean actually from a Buddhist point of view, I mean, I'm stretching the language just a little bit, but you would say like because we've spent beginningless familiarity with ignorance and afflictive emotions, that we're essentially insane. Really, is like the Buddhist perspective, and that if we don't practice the teachings, we'll stay insane. Is really the idea. In other words, that and really it's like this process where because we grasp at things as existing even in the wrong way, in a way they don't exist. We grasp at things existing independently when they're really dependent. Right? So we grasp at things as if they're kind of. We'll get into that later in Lam Rim, but we'll get into it much more detail. Actually, it's a huge treatment of emptiness, so we'll get into that. But because we grasp at things as existing in a way that they don't exist, from beginningless time we've sort of familiarized ourselves with all kinds of exaggerated and diluted ways of based on that, we make up all kinds of other wrong concepts about things. So things that won't make us happy, we think this will make us happy. Beings who are actually precious and are suffering, we kind of do this idea, if I can harm them, I'll be happy. It's insane. It's actually completely insane, really, it is. And the Buddhist view actually is that just that we've familiarized ourselves with that and that we don't apply an antidote, that we don't tame our minds at all. But actually, from a Buddhist view, the reason why I say it is easier to love is two things. One is, once we apply reasoning, and this is what His Holiness the Lama often points out, actually, is if we apply reasoning and we sort of familiarize it, we train our mind, basically, right? Which is familiarizing ourselves with the reasonings that show, actually, that these other ideas are completely wrong. Then we can sort of slowly decrease those and increase the positive emotions. And what the Dalai Lama points out, the reason why I say it's easier, what the Dalai Lama often says is positive emotions are actually realistic. Like love, right? And compassion. These are realistic emotions. And so he says those actually can be increased infinitely. And that's what enlightenment is, in a sense. But I guess the point really just of why do we do that is really just familiarity. In other words, is that we're familiar with this other way of being. And so it's easier for us to do that, or it's more spontaneous, let's say. Not easier, but it's sort of more habitual. That's really the word. It's just that we have this habit from past lives of doing that. But, and what Buddhism is saying, though, is that if you apply these methods in this life, you can completely stop that. But does that answer your question? I'm not sure. Really, familiarity is the idea from a Buddhist point of view.
Actually, we are born into it. So, like you said earlier, in my opinion, we are born into that desire realm. So we're predisposed to what we're doing right now.
Right, but we're only born in the desire realm because of our familiarity from past life with desire. You see, like, the reason we're born in a realm of desire is because we didn't practice Dharma in a past life to decrease our desire, to overcome it, so that's all. Yeah.
His Holiness points out that the first word we speak is ma, and that's mama, or mother, whatever it is. And actually in Tibetan it means I. So your I is defined right there, the self-grasping. And then if you look at it, the self-grasping, the unreal understanding of self, plus the afflictive emotions, would be the basis for suffering.
That's right.
And that's what we are born into. So basically ignorance plus afflictive emotions, destructive emotions, would give rise to the non-linear self that will cause all the suffering. Problem.
Just one question. Do you mean just the feelings, strong feelings of either anger, jealousy, or violence would land you in hell? You don't need to take actions like killing a person.
Yeah, you don't have. Yeah, because actually, from a Buddhist perspective, like there's physical karma, which would be like killing somebody, verbal karma, like screaming at somebody, or mental karma. So mental karma would be just like, so in other words, if I for sure it's true. So for example, if I'm watching, let's say if I'm watching TV, right, and I see whatever country I'm from, I see them bombing and killing other people, right, and if I just think, good, yeah, I'm so happy they're dying, they're evil, may they all drop dead. That's karma. That's enough to go to hell. Yes.
An opposite emotion would land you in hell.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, if you actually, that's very true. In Buddhist, from the Buddhist perspective, they call them sometimes they call meditation on the four immeasurables, like love, compassion, equanimity, and joy. There are different terms for those. One is immeasurable, but another term for those is Brahma Vihara. And one of the reasons they call it the Brahma Vihara is the Buddha said, if you're not practicing bodhicitta, if you're practicing bodhicitta, those become the cause of Buddhahood. But if you're not practicing bodhicitta, just meditating on those four immeasurables becomes a cause for rebirth as Brahma. The Lord of, the God, the God realm. And so, so that mental action of love causes rebirth in higher realms. Is right.
So that's a little confusing when you're thinking of the four actions that constitute a negative act. No, it is and it isn't. because you need all four in order to actually have a, what's it called, a throwing karma or a continuing karma. You see what I'm asking?
Yeah, so in that case, there's the, I'm just trying to go through it, so there's the,
Is it,
so for example, like take the example of the negative, well, actually, no, I think, because take the example of the 10 non-virtues, right? Take the example of the negative, you know, because, so take the example of the mental non-virtue, there are 3 mental, of the 10 non-virtues, 3 are mental, right? Karmas. So one would be ill will, that's using the example we were giving, right? And so, that's an interesting question, what would, so to create a complete karma of ill will, right, doesn't mean you do a physical action towards the person.
because you could actually have something arise, say, to, you have a cause for me to whack someone, but I think, man, this is not smart, and I don't do it, then that karma's exhausted.
Or it's incomplete, that's what you would say. That's a physical karma that's incomplete, it's an incomplete karma.
Well, but then the arising, when it goes away, that condition is no more.
I guess what I would say though is still
It's
that,
just interesting.
yeah, I guess though, one thing is, just to be clear though, like there's a difference, like so if the negative action is killing, we'll go through this in the teaching on karma itself, but if the negative action is killing, let's say, right, so then the person says, you know, I'm gonna kill Gabe, right, and then they go through a whole plan, you know, so there's like, and then to actually complete the karma, I would have to kill Gabe, right, that's what you're getting.
Right.
That's different from a negative karma of ill will, right? Or so then it'll be a whole different karmic, right? So if I were to think, I'm mad at Gabe, right? Then you still could cut it short. Like, so let's say I got mad at Gabe and then I thought, oh, wait a second, I don't want to indulge in anger, right? And I would apply an antidote at that point. That would be an incomplete karma of ill will, right? But if I were to like go through and do the whole action, right? Like, where you think, like, so if I were to think I'm mad at him, I hope this and that bad thing happens to him, and now I feel good about having thought that, because he deserves it. That's a complete mental karma then, right? So there's a difference. Like in other words, one is if I applied the antidote, it would be an incomplete action. But if I didn't complete an antidote, so if I thought, I'm mad at Gabe because he looked at me funny, and then I were to say, you know, I hope that this and this and this bad thing happened to him, I don't care about him at all, I hope he suffers a lot, and I'm right and he's wrong, I feel good about having thought that. Right? That would be a complete mental negative.
So me laughing when you say that about Gabe, we're all screwed.
Well, hopefully you weren't actually having ill will towards Gabe. We actually all love Gabe, so it's okay. We're lovingly using Gabe as an example.
What can you do if you do something like that, you have a very bad thought about somebody and you have completed it, but that maybe 2 years ago, and now you think, well, I was wrong. So do you depend on and
Oh yeah. So you purify. You have to do the purification. Yeah.
Yeah, but on the purification, probably repent is not enough. There should be a resolve that I'm not going to do it again.
Oh, there are 4 steps of purification. Yeah, we'll go through them in the karma. In the section on karma, we'll go through every detail about that. But yeah, there's a whole process of 4 powers of purification.
To come back to your question, probably the motivation sets it, right? The motivation, the larger motivation and the smaller motivation, and the motivation at the time of the action, the 2 motivation we're talking about, the thought process. I mean, it's very involved in terms of what kind of karmic disposition you're going to carry based on your thought and based on your action. So body, speech and mind, we're talking about mind here. And then we're talking about body that gets into action, which is karma. And then there is a larger motivation of either virtuous or non-virtuous side of it.
Just to be clear, though, it doesn't have to be a physical action to be a karma. It can also be a verbal action or a mental action. Too. But the motivation is what determines the nature of karma.
I mean, His Holiness gives example of like if you want to kill someone and you made a plan of a murder, you planned for years about it, and then at the time of the murder you ended up killing somebody else. The difference between the karma and the motivation is different.
Yeah, it's complicated.
It's complicated.
Okay, and then the next point he makes. So that was where we covered like it's very difficult to create the causes of oppression, right? So we look at a cause: ethics, generosity, patience, joyful effort. and stainless prayers and so on. And those are hard to create, so we recognize, wow, this is rare. Then the second point that he makes here in this is that it's rare in terms of the result. And he says, so he gives the example of, he says, first of all, so this is where you look around, actually, right? So if you're checking, is it rare to have a precious human rebirth? So he gives the example, he says, first of all, look at the lower realms, right? And he says, for them, even the mere happy realm seems hard to attain, right? So what he's getting is most beings are in the lower realms, right? And from their point of view, the vast majority are in the lower realms, and from their point of view, it seems almost impossible to ever even become human, right? Like, which is true. Does that make sense? So he's saying, if you look around, that's the reality. Then he says, then even among humans, right? Those with the 18 qualities of a precious human rebirth are extremely rare, and that's true too, isn't it? I mean, so this one you can do through your own direct observation, right? Whereas we went through that, like most beings are in the ocean, then most land creatures are insects, then even non-insects, they're all other kinds of animals and so on. So even being human is extremely rare, right? Then you look at human beings and you say, how many have a precious human rebirth? And you have to say, well, the vast majority don't, right, on this planet. So you say, okay, that's obvious, right? And then I just want to read a quote here. Like, then Lama Tsongkhapa said, he quotes another Lama, Geshe Dopa, and he says, Geshe Dopa laid great emphasis on this. He said that all other teachings come about brought on by this. As it is like that, you should strive accordingly, right? So this is an interesting point. What he's saying is, understanding this, right, all the other teachings, all the later points in the Lamrim, all the other stages of the path, in a way come about through understanding these points, right? And that's kind of what I was getting at earlier about this inspiration, right, that Rinpoche had said about, if you understand precious human rebirth and impermanence, that will motivate all these other practices. Otherwise, you'll be like a, what's it called? Like, there won't be any energy to your Dharma practice. So he's saying, really emphasize these points of precious human rebirth. And again, sometimes we want to skip over that and say, oh, I want to do some, like sometimes I think, sometimes people with, if we have a little bit of arrogance, then we can think, oh, I want to go to the most advanced topic. And he's saying, emphasize these early topics in Lamrim, and then your practice will go well, and you'll actually make progress. Otherwise, if you focus on the wrong thing at the beginning, even if it's very profound, they're saying, even if the teaching's profound, it may not be profound for you at that time. You have to be ready for that teaching. So he's saying, start at the beginning, go step by step. That's part of what he's saying. And now comes, okay, so we'll start on this next topic. So having covered precious human rebirth, I wanted to cover this too in the same context before we do like the meditation day on precious human rebirth. The head of the outline is how to take the essence, right? So the idea is, having understood that you have this precious human rebirth, you think, I want to take the essence of this opportunity, right? If you're smart, like the analogy, if you have the $25 million lottery ticket, you don't rip it up, right? You say, wow, I want to cash it in, right? So this is like, how do you cash it in, right? How do you cash in your valuable winnings? So this is what Lama Tsongkhapa explains next. He says, you take the essence of this precious human rebirth, and he says, by practicing the path, right? And he talks about the path of the 3 types of beings. So that's what I wanted to start covering next. And when we finish this topic, then we'll do the meditation today. And so he says here, all of the Buddha's teachings are included in what he's calling the paths of the 3 types of beings, right? And so you might ask, well, what are 3 types of beings? And that's what we're going to get into now. Does that make sense? And I wanted to, on page 44, Lama Tsongkhapa uses 2 different terms. One is 3 types of beings, and another is high status and ultimate goodness. this phrase of high status and, or ultimate certain goodness, or definite goodness, there are different translations. Those terms, first of all, the three types of beings is that phrase is emphasized in the Lamrim tradition because it actually appears earlier than Lamrim. It appears in texts by, I think, Sangha and other, and Maitreya. But Atisha, when he wrote the Lamb for the Path, the first Lamrim, he really emphasized this point about the three types of beings. And Nagarjuna, in his letter to a king, uses this phrase, high status and definite goodness. And it's the same idea. So high status in this sense, or relates to the first type of being, which is somebody whose main spiritual aim is for good future rebirth. And what they call that is the lower scope being. So I'm just giving you a context. So of these three types of beings, in a way, I'll start with this. Like a person, I'm kind of jumping ahead. It talks about this later, but it talks about there's the low, like a ordinary low scope or lowest low scope person, which is not a spiritual person at all. That's like the person who's spiritually no different from a rat or a spider. Right? So that's the person who doesn't have any particular spiritual aspirations. Right? But then they're talking about like a special low scope. So this is an actual spiritual person, practitioner. So a spiritual practitioner, the lowest level of spiritual practice, from a Buddhist point of view, is where the person is called, so it's called the low scope. And that person is looking for high status in a future life. So their motivation for spiritual practice is something beyond just being comfortable and popular and having enough stuff or whatever in this life. They're aiming for future lives. So that would be the low scope. The person's they practice some kind of spiritual training, and their dedication and in their heart, their motivation is, may I have a good future rebirth. May I be reborn in heaven. Something like that. If that's their main motivation, that's considered low scope. Because it's a temporary benefit. May I be reborn in the God realms, or may I be reborn as a human being again. Right? If that's the main motivation, that's a low scope. Right? I'm just giving a context here. Then there's the middle scope, right? The middling level spiritual practitioner. And they're now, to connect that to this idea of ultimate certain goodness, so there are two types in Buddhism of, I'm going to call it definite goodness. There are two types of definitive goodness, or definite goodness. One is your own personal nirvana, like liberation from all suffering. And then the other type of ultimate goodness is Buddhahood. And those are different, so which we'll get into more in a bit. But the middle scope person is aiming at definite goodness, but of their own personal nirvana. Does that make sense? So they're not just aiming for a good future rebirth, they're aiming from liberation from samsara. Right? They're aiming for a state of nirvana, of permanent liberation from suffering. Then the great scope, right? So the highest of the three types of beings is the bodhisattva, whose motivation is to be of benefit to all sentient beings, right? And therefore they're striving to become a Buddha in order to be of ultimate benefit to others. So I just want to make sure, first of all, because none of this other stuff is going to make sense if you don't understand what the three scopes are. So again, the first of the three, the low scope, right, is good future rebirth. The middle scope is higher than that. It's not just good future rebirth, it's to achieve liberation from suffering, right? A permanent liberation. For oneself, right? Then the third scope is much broader, right? It's a great scope, great in the sense that it embraces all beings. Right? So that person is saying, it wouldn't be enough just to achieve my own liberation. I need to be of benefit to others. Others' well-being is as important as my own well-being. Since others are numberless, actually their well-being is more than important than just me alone. Therefore, the purpose of my spiritual practice is to be of benefit to all beings, and to be of ultimate benefit, I must achieve Buddhahood. So do you get the idea of three different motivation scopes? I like the term scope because it's the scope of that person's mind, right? So the one person, they can only kind of, the scope that their mind can embrace is just this and future lives, right? Somebody else, they can embrace the idea of liberation. Somebody else, they can the scope of their mind is so broad that they can encompass all the welfare of all beings. So you get the idea there of what the three scopes or three types of beings are. And so the first thing that this is saying, the first thing that Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is that those within the three types of beings or the three scopes, you can include all the Buddha's teachings. In other words, all the Buddha's teachings are about helping others. The Buddha didn't, in other words, the Buddha, what he's saying is the Buddha himself in the past generated bodhicitta and strove to be enlightened to benefit others. And his way of benefiting others is by teaching these three scopes, right, or these three types of beings. So, so you could say all the Buddha's teachings can be encompassed by these three scopes. Does that make sense? So everything the Buddha taught, if you understand the Lamrim well, these teachings well, then you can see any teaching of the Buddha, you can say, oh, okay, this is for that purpose, this is for this purpose. You know, you would understand where it fits in, which scope of practice it's focused on.
Hey, Lord.
Yeah.
So why do you think Lama Tsongkhapa put that had to be emphasized there? Is there?
Which thing? You mean like that all the Buddha's teachings can be, or that?
Yeah. So was that lent to confusion or something like that?
I think, you know, early on, like in the text, right, we talk about how one of the benefits of the Lamrim, remember in the early part of the text it talks about one of the benefits of the Lamrim is like not rejecting any of the Buddha's teachings. So I think this is similar to that, isn't it? Like, or is it saying like that, you know, that then you know how to apply all the different teachings to a given person's practice, and like, that you wouldn't reject, yeah, so one benefit of that is that you wouldn't reject any teaching of the Buddha, right? Because you would know, you could see where each Buddhist teaching applies, what level of practice it applies to, so you don't think, oh, I'm above that, or, oh, that's not important. But you understand, oh, wow, that fits in here, that fits in there. I think that's one reason. I'm not sure if there are other reasons, maybe. But Lama Tsongkhapa does talk about something similar earlier, right? I guess it's also showing the greatness of the Lamrim in a way, right? That it's sort of, it's encompassing all the teachings of the Buddha. It's not just a partial teaching. But I'm not sure if there are other
Yeah, I was
reasons.
just wondering, because it's not, it's kind of interesting to see that being mentioned there, and I just thought that there was a reason for it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there are other reasons too, like,
Because why emphasize that there and not just go into the, I don't know.
actually, if you look at what he says here also, it does imply something else, the way Lama Tsongkhapa phrases it here, which is that, that's interesting, actually, because, you know, the headings are from Trijang Rinpoche, right, and then the actual text is from Lama Tsongkhapa. So I don't know for sure, but I can say one thing, if I read it here, right, as everything the Buddha did in the beginning, generating the mind of bodhicitta, in the middle accumulating collections, at the end manifesting complete Buddhahood, was all done for the welfare of sentient beings only. And all his Dharma teachings also only accomplish the welfare of sentient beings. I guess there are two things implied there, right? One is like, actually if you think about that, you start to feel like a sense of the Buddha's incredible kindness in teaching, right? These things, that's one thing. And you get the sense of that all of these are to save sentient beings from suffering, right?
Also, I would also think that, Dr. Lloyd, correct me, it also comes to a point that unless you have that understanding, you'll not be able to teach or impart knowledge based on predisposition of the scope that you're giving out to, right? So you're not going to give out some higher level teaching to a smaller scope, or middle scope, or whatever it is. So in that
Oh, I know
part-
what you're, we'll get to that, actually that comes later in the text, so I don't want to answer that yet. You'll see, Lama Tsongkhapa addresses that directly in the text itself, but at the end of this section, actually.
Right. So it makes it makes sense for a Buddha to have that kind of, you know, discernment, saying, what am I teaching? What am I? I mean,
Yeah, we'll see more about that actually. So I don't want to say too much because Lama Tsongkhapa says it's better than me. But yeah, I don't know if there are more reasons. Certainly, it talks about. I mean, certainly here it's really getting at the. As I say, that all of these teachings are to help others, basically, or to benefit us. But anyway, okay, so I'll go on. So the first thing he says here, and actually he quotes the Lamb for the Path to Enlightenment, which is by Atisha, where he says, whoever pursues by any means the happiness of samsara only, just for his own benefit, should be known as the least of beings, right? And so that's interesting, right? What it's saying here, that's interesting, because on the one hand, I just want to point out something, because it gets it later, right? On the one hand, we ourselves may not even be at the low scope, right? If our motivation is mostly for just the happiness of this life, then maybe we're not yet even at the low scope. That's a question.
Yeah, because that doesn't sound like low scope, that sounds like low scope.
But actually, this is low scope,
Into
because
rat hood.
no, actually, this is low scope because this is interesting. Think about it this way, right? A low scope person, right? Let's read that actually. Whoever pursues by any means, right? Conclude by meditation or something, right? The happiness of samsara only, right? So that could include good future rebirths, happy life in samsara, right? I want to be a god in heaven, or God realm in a heavenly realm, like for my own benefit, because it'll be better than being in hell, right? That's the lowest spiritual scope. Now the actual low, one thing that the commentaries explain, the actual, of course the actual lowest scope is no spirituality at all, right? Like just saying,
Anyway.
I just want to be happy in this life. And I want to point out something actually. Most people who practice, like in the West, when they advertise now, mindfulness, right, practice. And if they say, I'm not against this, I think it's good actually, but so I'm not putting it down, I think it's wonderful. But if they say, practice mindfulness because it's good for your health, or to be happy, that's not yet even low scope. That would be below low scope, actually, right? Because that's just for momentary comfort, right? Like in other words, make your mind a little more peaceful so you're a little less miserable. Now that's good, actually. I'm not putting that down. I think it's better than other ways people try to be happy that hurt people. At least that's a way of being happy that's not hurting others.
Dalai Lama calls it intelligent selfishness.
Yeah, but it's like that's not spiritual though. Right? From a Buddhist point of view, like even if you so whether you let's just say this, like whether you enjoy whereas if you learn whatever hobbies you have, including spiritual hobbies, right? If I'm using that term kind of on purpose in a way, if they're only aimed at this life, it's not a spiritual practice. Does that make sense? From a Buddhist point of view, that's not a spiritual scope. That's not included in anything that would be labeled Dharma practice. Right? So even if you were doing some kind of that's where actually that famous story from I've told it before, but there's a famous story of Lama Dromdonpa, who was a student of Atisha, right? And his student, where he had this older guy who was the guy was I forget the order, but the guy was meditating, and then Dromdonpa saw him and said, "That's nice that you're meditating. It'd be better if you practice Dharma." Right? Then the guy's like, "Oh, what does he mean?" And he started he was doing prostrations, and Dromdonpa sees him and says, "That's nice you're doing prostrations. It'd be better if you're practicing Dharma." And then he's like, "Oh wow, I'll study," and then he sees him, "Oh, that's nice, but it'd be better if you were practicing," and he tries all different activities, and finally the guy says, gets upset, and says I've been doing everything. What do you mean? What's practicing Dharma? I've been meditating, I've been prostrating, I've been reading, I've been doing mandala offering, whatever, whatever, all these different activities, right? Making water bowls, and whatever. And Atisha said, and Dromdonpa says to him, give up on this life in your mind. He says, what's Dharma? And Lama Dromdonpa says, give up on this life in your mind. Right? So in other words, that guy, what he was saying was that guy was doing all those things, but his motivation was only to be happy in this life. Maybe he thought, oh, people think, actually in America there's less danger of that, because if people see you sitting, maybe now meditating would be, but if people see you doing prostrations, they'll just think you're weird. Right? But which is an advantage for us in a way, right? But I guess in other words, in Tibet you could do that, and somebody could think, oh wow, you're very spiritual. You could do it for some kind of to seem cool.
Status.
status or something. Like, oh, I did my, but actually we could do that, right? Somebody could do like their, what's it called? We were talking about the other day about Nundro, 100,000 days. Right, so somebody could do that and they could say, oh, I did my Nundro. You know, like, oh, wow, you know. And that would be not a spiritual practice then, right? That would just be, that's the same as, you know, a spider has the biggest web, I don't know, something. It's like not spiritual practice.
So question, I still don't catch what you mean by practicing Dharma. Just giving up on this life is giving up this very power of it, right?
So what it's saying here is that we're practicing, actually, so this is a good question, what is practicing Dharma? So according to Lama Tsongkhapa, what we're saying is that practicing Dharma is not an, so let's go through this. Practicing Dharma, in this sense, is not an external activity, right? So in other words, practicing Dharma doesn't mean like wearing a certain kind of clothing or doing some particular physical activity, you know. So like if like a, you know, sort of like sitting in this posture or doing a prostration or what that quote is saying and what Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying is that practicing Dharma is mental, right, is a state of mind. And what Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying is if you're practicing Dharma, which means taking the essence of the precious human rebirth, it has to be according to one of these three types of being, one of the three scopes, right? It has to, if you don't have a motivation that's in accordance with one of these three, then you're not yet practicing Dharma. That's the first thing. And so now what we're getting is what's the bottom quality, you know, like we're starting with the low scope, right? So we're saying what's the minimum requirement? So you could say I'm practicing Dharma. Like the bottom requirement, you know, the minimum, let's say it like the most basic or something, right? The most, yeah, most basic or the minimum requirement.
Baseline.
The baseline, yeah. And so what Lama Tsongkhapa is here is saying is that the minimum requirement is that the person, so he says here special lesser beings, right? So he's talking about, when he says special lesser beings, that means a spiritual person, right? That's what that means really. In our language, I would say that. That means a person who's practicing some kind of spirituality. Do so mostly act for the sake, do not mostly act for the sake of this life, pursuing instead the excellence. So it means the basic, like, so the minimum requirement would be that, and Lama Tsongkhapa is very clear here. He's not saying that that person would never do anything, like that they never do anything for this life. He's saying their main motivation most of the time is for future lives. Right? That's the most basic. Right? That person, their main focus in life, their main motivation is that they're trying to create good karma to have a better future life. Right? That's their sort of their main focus in life. And he says that's the lowest level of spiritual practice, or the lowest level of Dharma practitioner. So that answers it, right? So in other words, in their mind, their main thought is, I want to do this because I want to have a better future rebirth, right? I don't want to suffer in the lower realms. I don't want to be reborn in hell or hungry ghost or animal. I want to have a good life in the future life. And so I'm doing these actions, and that's my motivation. So then they're doing some kind of virtuous action, and their main motive is, I want to have a good future. So that's the minimum requirement. To say, then they're practicing some kind of taking the essence, using Lama Tsongkhapa's term. He said, how do you take the essence of the precious human rebirth? That he says that's the minimum level of taking the essence.
Dr. Lauren, I had a question.
Oh, sure.
So, talking about the scopes, probably below the list beings or the list scope that we have would be animals. We human beings tend to behave like animals.
Well, according to what Lama Tsongkhapa, if you look at the teachings on precious human rebirth, what he's been saying is that the vast majority of human beings are also not yet practicing spiritual.
And then coming back to example that you gave last week about Lama Zopa, like he builds mantras and gives to dog and all kind of things. I think he's liberating even the animals. How
Yeah.
does that tie in together? Like,
Oh, go ahead. What's the question?
so the question would be, for a spiritual Lama or Rinpoche, I mean, they would be able to even liberate animals as opposed to human beings. I mean, it almost sounds that way. I've seen videos like the dog would come in and just, bow in front of them. So,
Yeah, the teachings, the teachings are clear I guess I would differentiate in a way we have to separate two things. What this teaching is getting at is the motivation in oneself. So that's the main issue here. You're asking about something a little bit different, which is how to benefit others, right? How a bodhisattva, let's say, benefits others. And that's clear in many teachings, and sutras and tantras both. So it's Mahayana teachings, right? So that's a different topic than this in a way. But what that's saying is that there are certain practices that people can do using certain sometimes, like, for example, reciting the names of certain Buddhas, like the medicine Buddha, or reciting certain mantras, or doing certain prayers, certain special practices, that through which a bodhisattva or a practitioner, let's say, can benefit another being. And so that other being doesn't have to have a virtuous motivation in that case.
Okay.
But it's because of the
Could be
power of the
animals,
bodhisattva.
but could be animals, but because of the power, it can influence even that.
Yeah, so it's a way of kind of blessing them and giving them some benefit. But that's not through the power of the animal's motivation, or they could do it to a human being too.
Gotcha.
But it's not through that's different than this. That's like through the power of the other that one receives some kind of benefit through a special mantra or prayer or Buddha's name. But that's not yet oneself doing a spiritual practice. That's like the other person doing a spiritual practice on my behalf or on the animal's behalf, and trying to give some kind of blessing that helps them to eventually become a spiritual practitioner.
So it's independent of the scope at that point. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, it's not dependent on the other scope. It's dependent upon the blessing power of the Buddha or the Bodhisattva that power comes. So it's a different issue. Yeah, that's not through one's own practice. That's through the power of the other person's practice, actually. But okay, so do people understand? Wait a few minutes. Do people understand this low scope? What the meaning is? What Lama Tsongkhapa is saying the meaning is of low scope here. So then he says, of the two types of certain goodness, the first is, we just said, release from samsara, right? The achievement of nirvana. So then he says, for those who, and actually I'll go a little slow through this, so this will be maybe the last topic for today. Right, so this is the medium scope, right? And so this is a little bit, it's not too complicated, but it's a little bit, some people may not know, so I want to go slow through it. So first I'll read the quote from Atisha's Lamp for the Path. He says, indifferent to the pleasures of existence, means samsara there. So indifferent to the pleasures of samsara, one desists from evil deeds. Whoever pursues only personal peace is called an intermediate being. So first of all, what Atisha is saying there is anyone who stops doing negative actions and practices Dharma with the motivation of their own personal peace, right, or their own individual liberation, individual peace, right? That's the medium scope. So it means they're not just aiming at a good future rebirth. This person is aiming at, what does that mean actually? It means like liberation from samsara, right? So it means they're aiming at some kind of permanent peace, permanent inner peace, right? Where they're no longer suffering. So that's they're no longer they no longer have suffering or the causes of suffering in their being. Does that make sense? And so this would be in accordance with the Four Noble Truths, right? So there's right, and people have heard those, right? There's the truth of suffering and the cause of suffering, right? And so this person understands the Four Noble Truths, right? They understand that I've been subject to suffering since beginning this time because I have the causes of suffering in my mind, right? Ignorance and attachment and aversion and the other afflictive emotions. So this person knows, okay, I understand the nature of suffering, and I understand what the causes of suffering are. Then they understand the second set of two noble truths, right? That there is such a thing as liberation from suffering, and that there's a path to that liberation. And so that person decides, I want to travel that path because I want to achieve liberation because I'm tired of suffering. And if it's possible for me to get beyond suffering permanently, that'd be wonderful. Like, I'm really tired of it. It's really horrible. And so that person then decides to practice the path to liberation. And so that person would be medium scope practitioner.
So this is like an arhat.
So that's what I want to say next. Is this says Lama Tsongkhapa here says something that I wanted to get into because a lot of times I think people have been confused about this at times. So Lama Tsongkhapa here says the vehicles of hearers and solitary realizers. Right? So and I want to explain what that means because this could be. I think people have gotten confused. Various people have asked me questions about it. So I just think it's a confusing point sometimes. So. So what this means is, within this intermediate or medium scope, right, one is aiming, as Gabe said, to become an arhat. But actually, arhat is a confusing term in a way. So I want to almost simplify it. So what Lama Tsongkhapa is literally saying here is there are actually within the medium scope, right, to achieve individual liberation. He says there are two vehicles within that scope. So I just want to explain what that means. One, he says, is the vehicle of the hearers, and the other is the vehicle of what he calls solitary realizers. Okay? And so what he's saying there is this, is that that among people who want to achieve their own liberation from samsara, there are two types. So one he's calling hearers, which is a English translation of a Sanskrit word shravaka, which means hearer. And so that, like the hearers would be beings who, let's just say this. Well, literally, it would be the beings who met the Buddha, right? I mean, like, so for example, the Buddha's own disciples who who became arhats. So that could include like Shariputra, Mahamogalyana, Ananda. You know, there are many different beings who became who achieved their own liberation, right? But anybody who but in essence, this the vehicle of hearers would be beings who heard the Buddha's teaching on the Four Noble Truths, right? Decided I want to achieve my own liberation, and then started practicing. We could say either the Noble Eightfold Path, right, or who began. You could say another way of saying it is who practiced the three higher trainings. So they're practicing ethics, meditative concentration, and wisdom, because they want to achieve their own liberation from samsara. And so the person who progresses on that vehicle, right, they go through various levels of progress, and if they achieve the end of that vehicle, they become an arhat. Does that make sense? So that person on the hearer vehicle would have to, they would go through. But what he's saying here is they become a person of the intermediate scope. They're not yet an arhat, of course. They're just somebody who's aspiring to their own liberation. And then if they succeed in that path, they eventually achieve nirvana, right? Their own individual nirvana. And somebody who's achieved their own individual liberation from samsara, as Gabe pointed out, is called an arhat. So that means, an arhat means foe destroyer. So they've destroyed the inner foe of their own ignorance and afflictive emotions, and therefore they're liberated. Right? Because liberation from samsara doesn't come from going anywhere, like to some place. It doesn't come from anything external. It comes from an internal state of having destroyed the foe, in this sense, of one's own ignorance and afflictive emotions. Because if you don't have any ignorance and you don't have any afflictive emotions, then you can't suffer, is the idea. Because suffering comes from an internal source, which is ignorance and all the afflictive emotions, so like anger, pride, jealousy, desire, all those different afflictive emotions. So if you completely overcome ignorance, then all the other afflictive emotions also get destroyed, and then you achieve your own liberation.
Well, it seems how there's, 4 levels, stream enter through arhat. It seems to imply a progression from lower to middle to upper scope also.
No, it doesn't. That's important. So,
Well, no, it does. I agree that maybe it shouldn't be taken, but it's easy to take it that way.
okay, and I mean, it doesn't change, and not in terms of scope in this sense. Like, they don't become a Mahayana scope through that. That's
No,
right.
but I mean, it seems like when they talk about one scope and then another scope and then another scope, it feels like there's a progression. You have to do one, and then you have to do, there's some sort of progression.
You mean like, well, just so I'm clear, do you mean
Kinda
like
elementary school, junior high, high school.
oh, we'll get to that. Yeah. There's some truth to that, actually. That there is some truth. We'll get to that later in the text. First, Lama Tsongkhapa is really clearly explaining what the 3 scopes are. Then he gets at that point, which is, you're right. There is this progression, or should be.
Damn.
There should be for a practitioner. For us, there should be.
Okay.
Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, if you're practicing the Lam Rim, there should be a progression for you, but not, but for the person who, well, I don't want to get too far into it yet, but because let me first finish explaining this, and then, but next class we'll get into exactly that. That's the main point of next class, actually. Because I want to be sure before we stop to explain this. So one is this person who's gonna who heard the Four Noble Truths, is practicing the vehicle of the hearers, and is trying to achieve their own individual liberation from samsara. That makes sense up to that point. I just want to clarify. Then he talks about solitary realizer. So you might say, what's the difference between a hearer and a solitary realizer? And this term can be confusing to people. So solitary realizer, like I said, hearer is a translation of the Sanskrit word shravaka. Solitary realizer is the translation of a Sanskrit word called prajeka Buddha, which is not a Buddha. So sometimes that's where it's confusing, because that's the word, it has the phrase or the term Buddha in it. Sometimes people think that means Buddha, but it doesn't. So that's why I think it's good that they translated solitary realizer, because Bud means awake, so it means awaken or realize. So in that sense, it's a good translation. I mean, and prajeka means solitary, so it's a solitary person who on their own gains a realization. Does that make sense? That just the term means that.
Dr. Lard, Shravaka means the hearer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, so the first hearer is that, but now I'm reading the second term, which is solitary realizer. So that's the second category of middle scope practitioner. And so just in terms of motivation, to be clear, because what the main issue here is motivation, right? So the individual, the lowest scope, remember, they were motivated by the wish to a good future rebirth. Then a hearer is somebody who hears the teachings of the Four Noble Truths and develops, their motivation becomes, I want to achieve nirvana as quickly as possible. I want to get out of samsara. I'm tired of this, right? And I'm going to practice the path in order to achieve that. Does that make sense? The solitary realizer is a particular kind of middle scope practitioner, just to clarify this. They're somebody who also, like the hearer, wants to achieve their own liberation. So that's the same. They're just a little bit different in this way. They somehow have they have a particular personality style or disposition or something, where they feel that they want to realize that alone. So they don't want to realize it while studying under a Buddha, like those hearers. So they develop some kind of motivation where they hear teachings from a Buddha, but they're like a very solitary type of person. And so they sort of think, I like this teaching, I want to achieve liberation, but I want to do it on my own. And so they practice for longer. It actually takes them longer than the hearers. They practice for, I think that one text said an eon. But they accumulate some kind of merit, they meditate, they have to have heard teaching from a Buddha on emptiness, particularly. And they meditate on that. They develop meditative concentration, and they meditate on emptiness. But the unique quality, one unique quality they have is they come at a time when there is no Buddha present, and the Buddha's teachings have died out. And they are some kind of solitary person who goes off and meditates and achieves liberation. They actually achieve nirvana, and they don't teach, though. So they don't turn the wheel of Dharma. So they're this kind of person who, in dark ages, when there's no Buddha around, people kind of look at them and say, wow, that guy looks really peaceful. Or that woman looks very peaceful, whatever. That person looks really peaceful. And sometimes people make offerings to them because they look so peaceful. And they create some good karma in relation to them. But they won't teach the path. That's not their disposition, is not to be a teacher. And so they don't, in that sense, their motivation, again, is they don't have bodhicitta. They don't feel responsible for the welfare of others. They do benefit others just by kind of being around. In other words, they're so peaceful that they sort of give people some idea, wow, it's possible to have some peace. And maybe people feel some inspiration because of them, and people make offerings to them, or whatever. In other words, people can create good karma in relation to them, but they don't set in motion a liberating dharma for others to practice. They just sort of achieve liberation, they kind of be peaceful, and then they sort of pass away. So their scope is the same as that of the hearers, in the sense that they want their own liberation. They just have their own unique set of practices to do that alone. Does that make sense? So I just want to clarify. So if you hear Prajeka Buddha, don't think that means a Buddha. That's somebody who achieved their own individual liberation, in this way, you know, but wanted to do it even more individually in a way, not as part of a community. You know, so oftentimes like Pratyeka Buddhas will be somebody who, during a dark time when there's no Buddha around and no Sangha community, they're somebody who kind of is born, they kind of drop out and go off to the wilderness and meditate, and then people come across them as they're hiking and say, wow, what a peaceful person. How cool, you know. But if they ask them questions, you know, they kind of just nod and smile and don't explain the path. But so, do you get an idea? Now we've got to stop, but I'll just say, so those are the two types of practitioners of the middle scope, right? One who's aspiring to their own liberation quickly, through the Four Noble Truths by listening to a Buddha, and the other is somebody who is going to actually, who's aspiring to their own individual liberation, but kind of alone, and therefore it'll take them longer.
So by the definition I understand of mind never ends.
Right.
So they like solitary realizes forever?
That, actually, the different philosophical schools in Buddhism have different positions on what happens. Like, so, some of the schools of the lower philosophical tenet schools, so the schools that are more associated with, with the vehicle of individual liberation. So like the Vaibhashikas and the Svatantrikas, Svatantrikas rather, they say that some of those schools will say things like, there are certain sub-schools of them that will say they blow out, like a candle blown out, or something like that.
The mind?
That's their position. So some Buddhist schools will assert that, yes, that the mind sort of blows out like a candle blown out. Nagarjuna and the followers of the middle way school say that's impossible. Whereas that mind is beginningless and endless, and that therefore those beings sort of abide mentally in some kind of state realizing emptiness, and therefore they don't suffer. And it's interesting, like some followers of among Mahayana schools, some followers of the Chittamatrin, the mind-only school, they say that those beings kind of can permanently forever just abide. The mind continues, but it sort of abides in this sort of realization of emptiness, essentially, and so they don't suffer. Followers of the middle way school, the Madhyamikas, they say that those beings, after spending long periods of time in this sort of individual peace, that the Buddhas themselves come to those beings and sort of say, hey, others are in need, wake up.